Before I would like to thank all my colleagues for this incredible welcome to South Africa with all the problems and uncertainties with visa and all this kind of thing. But sometimes, names matters. I think it's that people sometimes wanted to hear their name when you greeting them. The first one I wanted to say thank you to Frita, Stephen, Andrew, Numosa, Kurt, Jane, Virginia, Afifa, Moneb, Sharon, and Thomas. I think I'm skipping maybe one, but I try to remember the names of everyone when I try to. When Numosa asked me for the lecture, I already did 2 lectures and I didn't like it and I changed it today. And I think I was talking with Frifa yesterday. I am kind of picky about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say. And I decided to concentrate in what I think is allow me to think more about the subject matter. What are the problems we have to face as an art historian or thinker of the art, and how we somehow find a new way to deal and solve this problem from the actual practice of writing. Something for me is start from what I call the limbo after postmodernity. And there's many of the problems, and many of the people wanted to define what really happened after postmodernity, and no one hasn't really come with a very useful or clear concept. I will get into maybe the one intent to define that. For me, it's a kind of failure. But anyway, it's a kind of uncertainty after what postmodernity means, because it was so big and so dominant over the 80s and early 90s, and it somehow create like kind of empty space in theory and writing about artistic practice in the 21st century. And I think it's something that has to do more with the idea of globalization. It's a term used pretty often by many institutions when they want to talk about art. They talk about the art in the time of globalization or global art. It's a kind of term you would see all the syllabus in many art history departments in the US as a way to escape not defining artistic practice from the heritage of ism that you will find before postmodernity. One is it had to do with the crisis of ism. Like we don't have anything like we can call anymore after postmodernity. The crisis of discipline, like specific like history, and anthropology, that they think they're going through a crisis. The only way that crisis could be solved is through our history. Because pay attention to the visual been ignored for many years by anthropology as a discipline. Advance in transportation and telecommunication, in this case, internet is pretty much everywhere right now. Even you can have a pin drive here and communicate with your computer in your home. Something used to be like almost impossible 5 years ago. And it's a kind of integration, the whole economic and trading system in the world. And somehow we believe we are connected. We believe we are closer to each other. And I think it's kind of illusion many of the people have in the 21st century. But that takes me to what I call the new term. Sometimes we use contemporary art. This is pretty much a request for today. Multiple modernities as a way to talk about African art in the 21st century. We say we should address how Africa understands modernity as a way to give a kind of second try and a second space to writing from Africa, from an African perspective and experience. Global art, globalization, and ultra-modern is the one that was part of the triennial at the Tate Britain, 2009. So I think it's the first, I think the only, as far I know, intent to define what's happening in contemporary art in the 21st century. What are the new route to follow, and how we define the principle of this new time, a new momentum in our production. And that takes us to the challenge, what I think is the challenge of the 21st century. In a century, many African artists or Caribbean artists or Latin American artists believe we are participating in the system. We are part. The system is so democratic, we are so equal level to modern practice in the Western context. But ultra-modern is the exhibition that was put together for the Tate Triennial, and I have a chance, I was living in London at the time, and the idea from Nicolas Bourdieu is he think about this new moment in our history, in a new type of individual, a new type of artist. It's more like he defined as an ethnographer. Someone is defined the artistic practice through using the tools of ethnography as a discipline. Doing field work, doing research is important for. And when you go to, to study the etymology of the word, Arthur means in all English, castrate, spade, and somehow he thought he was proposing to castrate modernity and propose a way to make the modernity a little bit more funky by including these other spaces of modernity like Africa, Latin America, or the Caribbean. Or the other association he used in the catalog is the idea of high, and somehow repeat the traditional trope, high art or low art. I mean, and somehow he's presenting this idea of high modernity as a way as a new model to understand artistic practice in the 21st century. But the principle he thinks is very important in the 21st century, in this limbo time. One is the end of postmodernity. That is he thinks is the only certainty everyone knows ends, but no one knows what is after that. The second is the idea of hybridity, creolization, syncretism. They are very expensive words, $500, very difficult to swallow, and very difficult to define. But people like expensive words. I don't like it. I like simplicity. But anyway, the idea of hybridity, that we are so intermingled, we are so mixed each other, that we somehow allow to empower us to understand the new paradigms, the cultural exchange between the West and the East, or the West and Africa. Traveling as a new way to produce form or classification and need, expanding format of art. Humans are archipelago. This idea, we are like a multiple island moving together into where. It's hard to understand, but anyway, this idea of a continent somehow still as a paradigm to achieve. The nomadic habit, the artists in the 21st century, they are used to travel. And they like to travel. They don't like to be in one single place, because the idea of nomadic is allow you to be part of these art systems, and you are integrated at the kind of democratic level. A new artistic practice based in translation. You're allowed to translate from your own experience in Africa into the new mainstream artistic world. And in a way, what we do from the Caribbean, or from Latin America, or from Africa, or from China, or from Southeast Asia, is to translate our specific cultural experience into the main language of modernity, or postmodernity, you want to call. The other problems, I think, when you face our history and artistic practice is, in the end, there's still those problems. I think they haven't been solved. This idea of problems and dichotomy, the idea of primary sources. When we are writing and putting together exhibition, primary sources, they are very important for us as an art historian or as a curator. The colonial narrative in somehow is important because we need to acknowledge all the post-colonial theory that is somehow allow us to see a different, new dynamic, a social dynamic in a completely different way. Misunderstanding of cultural differences and somehow that allow to be a little bit more ethical and more in tune to other cultures. History, the history of an imperialism, political system, sometimes the lack of what we think the local agency in artistic practice in a place. Disciplinary constructed narrative, how the different history or anthropology, ethnography, or archaeology have a different way to tell the story about specific subject matter. And universal law, what we call art, because this is what really rules us. Or the dichotomy would be theory versus methodology, history versus orality. That have to do a lot with African art and African diaspora. And I think there is a division in the field of African art. There's not really a big field, very nasty for the amount of people who really practice within that field. But there is a division between the historical Africanist, the one that had to do with something that happened in the past, and they call Africanism like a pure African art. And the other position to that is the art historian who deal with issues of contemporary or modernity, and they are not compatible. Those different understanding of a study of the case of Africa, or modernity versus modernization. We think modernization of a country is synonymous of modernity in the place of, like, you think in Angola is a quintessential example of the people thinking modernity somehow arrived to a place like Angola after the Civil War for many years. Or the typical contradiction, civilized versus traditional. When you think about contemporary art, it would be more like the civilized understanding versus traditional would be the historical African traditional art. Or culture versus the individual high art versus low culture, or craft or high art. But when we think about art versus culture, we still, in this kind of hierarchy, in somehow is still dominating the way we think about art history. When you think about craft, it's pretty much this being the center of African conventional art history for many years, versus the idea of understanding cultural production in a more multicultural visual platform. But in art history principle, what I think is still somehow relevant for writing art history and putting together exhibition, in somehow authenticity is still important. And you cannot, even from a contemporary perspective, authenticity is still, you go to the Wuden, an exhibition, the first thing they wanted to know when the piece gets to the museum, who made it, or not who made it in specific context, was before what colonial context that piece arrived, the serial number, and you can say that piece is authentic. Provenance is still important for African art, and it's why you have sort of increasing somehow pushing so much and spending an amount of incredible amount of money to prove the authenticity and the provenance of historical African art. The quality of the art is still important. And ideology and theory is somehow, I think, is relevant for us, and that allow us to be inscribed in a particular school of thinking. The idea of African art and culture and these incredible tangible positions as that allow us to understand the role of what is African historical art versus what is contemporary African art. That in somehow had to do with the desire for many artists in the periphery, in the diaspora, or outside the European context, to be part of this modernity. Is this a desire? Sometimes we cannot stop many of the artists to be part. Everyone would like to be in an exhibition at MoMA. Everyone would like to be in an exhibition at Tate. Everyone wanted to be an important exhibition, and that desire, I think, is more powerful than anything else in the way that political relationship take place at the end of the day. But the history, the good thing, and I think it's pretty much the light at the end of the tunnel, is more than 500 years of writing our history. That is somehow I benefit from that. And doesn't matter if Ghana is so full of African art, there is a 500 years of art history that is somehow allow me to talk about different subjects and how these things change. And I think it's an incredible privilege to be an art historian. And you can go from 16th century, from the concentration of unique of the work of art, specific in the Renaissance. And Vasari would be the best example you can have. And you can go through all the different changes in the evolution of the subject matter in art history as a discipline. But I just wanted to concentrate in the 21st century, the time we are living right now, when we think a concern of history and cultural patrimony is very important. Identity is still very important, and heritage. They are three of the main concepts that you can find very often in the writings about contemporary African art right now. All subject matter have to do with cultural production or visual culture in the 21st century. You cannot avoid to talk about heritage, identity, and patrimony. And their concepts, they bounce back from late 70s and 80s in Latin America, and somehow they came back to mainstream writing. And I think the last is the sense of integration. It's somehow people who are writing from the periphery, they think that there is a way in and these kind of democratic tones allow us to have an equal voice into the system. But what I think is something you cannot forget. When you think about art in general, I think that let's get a little bit more funky, go from reading the text and have an image. When you think about African art, and it used to be contemporary at the time, because this idea of contemporary is very complicated and complex. But this is a term fetish. They have a very bad connotation in African art, and even the word that doesn't have a bad connotation is handmade. It's like all Portuguese is what that means, fetish in all Portuguese. But it somehow get a term having through French filter into English. But this is on the left, on the top left, where you have a Pigafetta print being compiled in debris books, the Atlas of the World of the time from the 15th century, depicting destroying what idols and fetish. The second one is from an Araudi manuscript in Italy, from Kawasi, 100 years later, also documenting the destruction of the fetish. And the last one is the last 19th century photograph in the Congo from, I found this on the Tervuren archive, also burning fetish. I mean, I just show you more than 400 years of systematic destruction of African art, just through documentation of Western tradition. Just to give an example, how this systematic undermining of African tradition takes place. But you have another layer of that I think is more problematic when you bring the idea of superstitions or witchcraft or black magic. And this is an illustration from a newspaper in Belgium in 1930 that talk about Congolese living in Brussels. And it's the way they're talking about this cultural practice. It's interesting because it's right after the time many of the people believe that tradition being destroyed or being burned by this wave of destruction for over 500 years. But it's funny because I did an experiment a few days ago, getting the tiny minibus. You go into like a lot of people pile into like more than 20, 15, and I went in random places and started talking with the people in this minibus. I don't know how you call it here. Also with the normal taxis, and I walk. And all the conversation I have with the driver was about witchcraft, and they accusing witchcraft or black magic, superstition, all the tragic they have in their personal life to witchcraft. And it's somehow this idea that witchcraft is still resonating in the life of many people, common people in South Africa in the streets. The one I try to understand. But after that, I thought that the first, and I think the first and more efficient way in African art we try to solve this problem of what is contemporary art. Contemporary art, that means we should not talk about the traditional art have a negative connotation. The historical, I prefer to use historical art because you give a kind of restorations back to then, kind of bring the kind of value back in history. And I think that exhibition from Polly Roberts, and I just want to show you the illustration, is the reverse, suggest an exhibition should change the role of exhibition space. And what you have is the people engaged in the plexiglass, and the Nkisi and Kondi, the Congolese work, what we call fetish. They are walking in the street, in the gallery space, and it's pretty much like it turned human into a subject of curiosity and investigation. And the real culture, real object should be free walking into the museum. I think it's a metaphor for the problems. This is 1994, and this is the most important exhibition about African art at the African National Museum of African Art. After that, I think there is now an exhibition that interrogates those issues of how we deal with the separation with these different artistic practices. So now we think to inscribe yourself in contemporary practice, in somehow you are far away from what I call the historical art. We should reject it, because the rejection, stronger the rejection, closer you are to these issues of contemporary contemporary sensibility. And also when you think of something like that, this is an example on Nkisi. This is my drawing from the turbulence. This is what I do. I study. I take it apart, send the different part to the lab, and try to understand how the medicine works in there. This is what I've been doing for many years, hundreds and hundreds. I send it to the lab, but this is my note from studying all this object at turbulence. But this is the actual object, the ones you find in the box among thousands of them at review, and no one, maybe I am the second person being in that place in the last, I don't know, 100 years. But when you deal with contemporary, this is a specific contemporary artists like Kendall Gears, Twilight of the Idols. You know, even you have it's the words being chosen for that idols. They have a very bad connotations in African art and historical African art. All these objects have a proper name, a long name that describe what they do and what they are important. Just give you an example. You can tell through the wrappings of Nkisi and Kondi on the left, and you can see the aesthetic relationship with the actual Nkisi, and wrapping also is very important in African art, in traditional Congo tradition. The nailing, zonzo, also is very important in the African tradition. The idea of package is very important, like wrapping in the Congo tradition. You have like 4 different Congo tradition is somehow connected to that. They completely ignore with that particular work. I'll just give an example how this, you can be contemporary if you want. And this is just a Cuban artist, Tania Rivera, who used the image of Nkisi and Kondi from coffee table book. There is not a tradition of Nkisi and Kondi in Cuba with nails, as far as I know. And she copied that from coffee table books in New York, and she went back to Cuba and dressed up herself as a gigantic Nkisi and associated with the Yoruba tradition. It's very perverse association with the Congo tradition without really giving the full credit to the Congo tradition in the Cuban context. But this is another example from, you can go from something like that into a doll. This is what you find in a Congo house in Cuba. And what you put inside that dolls is traditional medicine. In a way, they're replacing the ceramic or the fabric or the actual wooden work by contemporary object. But they are building those objects in the same methodology of Nkisi and Kondi. But just giving a sense that how this contemporary mind is still working in the present day, using contemporary framework without betraying the methodology of traditional historical art. We don't have to really intermingle with other issues of aesthetic noise that is somehow, like in the case of Tania Bruguera, make it a little bit more problematic the reading into the role of a Congo tradition in the making of a Cuban identity. That I think is get a little bit more confusing. If you don't know those issues from outside, you think, wow, this is an incredible celebration of. But also, this is on the left. This is a Nkisi and Kondi from the one you will see in the museum, and they went from $500 to $1.5 million. This is the price of Nkisi and Kondi, the highest that you can find in Sotheby or Christie. And this is an Nkisi that was found in Suriname in the rainforest in the 19th century. And was taken by 2 professors from Harvard. It's part of now the people that you can find at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. And I told you about how this Congo tradition continue working in the diaspora, specifically in South America, and following the same rules and the same methodology and the same aesthetic of the Congo art, something we sometimes dismiss because we think those traditions really died in Africa before. Number 2, they've been completely hybridized with Christianity. And I think it's another problem for many of our historians. I would prefer not to use their name here. But anyway, I think that the second intent beside the exhibition was a practical exhibition from Polly Roberts. In 2009, I went to an exhibition, a symposium at the Cameron Lee with George Marcus, and the exhibition, the conference was about the crisis of anthropology and issues of performance practices in the academic environment. And we published a book by everyone contribution, and we have a panel at the end of the 3 days, talking about how we solve the problem. It was an initiative from Marcus, who thought anthropology was going through the most severe crisis in the history of the discipline, and he asked into art history as a discipline of art to come to rescue anthropology at the time. But what he thinks is that crisis allowed him to understand better the new artists, these artists who behave like a nomad. It's a kind of nomadic behavior, and somehow had to do with this idea of a crisis in anthropology. And but he thinks the idea of a green room is what he thinks is to define this new artistic practice. The green room is the World Trade Organization. The actual green room is green. When nations come to term and make deals, and sometimes fail to make deal. The place, the stream, reflection, context, specificity, and anticipation, final place for staging and perform. He thinks all the people, all the politicians who are invited to the World Trade Organization, that they are equal, and there is a kind of moral bound to try to solve those problems. There is a commitment and attention to the audience, in this case, to the problem they wanted to solve, poverty, hunger, and so forth. But there is a place when everyone negotiates the political power into the final decision in a kind of democratic way. A free work is important because the artists, the way they're behaving right now, they do research. They investigate the subject matter before they make a piece of art. This is what they think is the new kind of pseudo-anthropological practice you will find in many artists of the 21st century. And he thinks it's something that started in the late 80s, early 90s, but it's more present, more evidence in the present day. The art also believes in spectacle. It's about performance. It's about the events that is important more than the art itself. And ethnography allows you to have a better description, better details about the subject you wanted to study. It's pretty much is the way he described the 21st century artistic model. But the idea of the green room, I was thinking about the real green room. This is a herbalist from Mbanza, Congo. It's my mentor. And he was teaching me how to identify all the different plants and how to combine all of them to do traditional medicine. And I just took a photo. When I heard this idea of the green room, I went to my archive and found this photograph of the real green room when you have someone dealing with the green and try to solve, real problems. And this idea of the green also been in Africa now for many years. This is a photo illustration from Laman from the 19th century, and this is the actual market when you can find traditional medicine in Mbanza, Congo. What I think is a generous intent to solve the problem. Before I use curatorial practice, second, an anthropologist from theory try to suggest a way to move forward. And the last one I think is more about art itself. I think they are the three layers. I still operating sometimes in correlation. And I was thinking in an artist like Jose Bedia, who is a contemporary artist, who initiated in the Congo tradition in 1981. This was at the time, and it had to do more with Joseph Kosu impact in the Caribbean in the beginning of the 1980s. And Bedia, who was my professor of painting at San Alejandro Academy, he initiated in the Congo traditions, and right after that moment, the Congo tradition came to more relevant in his work. But it's very subtle in a way. But what I think is for me, is a model we should follow and somehow might think about. He decided to bring the three visual languages together in one single frame. And this idea of tautology you will find in later in 1960s in conceptual art in the West. It goes back to this relationship with the image, what constitutes an image. And there's an incredible example from Joseph Kossou that Bedia used as a reference. And when you have the photograph of the shirt, you have the definition from the dictionary and the actual object, and they think they operate at the same level of conceptualization. The brain never made a distinction between the concept, the photograph, and the object. That is the kind of igualitarism of the three different images. And this is what you have here. Kossou is more like intellectual, but in the case of Bedia, it's what made more clever. Is you have the actual graphic writing from the Congo tradition called Firma's signature. He using the name of Sarabanda written in the Congo tradition in Cuba, embodies the actual outlines of a human. Sarabanda is a corruption from Kikongo with Spanish, and Sala Banda, the master of the iron. This is what means in Kikongo. Few people they don't know, but just to give it the sense of mixing Kikongo word with the Spanish, and you have a Western tradition, so the writing in the Western tradition, and you have the outlines in the Western tradition of the king or the master of the iron. That's pretty much these three different representations of god of irons, cutting edge, coming together in three different. One, by the definition, what is Sarabanda? Sarabanda are the irons. This is what means on the top. There's an actual definition. What is Sarabanda? The second one is the actual depiction, outlines, all tools and working things that is in the head of the human figure. And the number three is the actual writing of Sarabanda in the body of these three things coming together in one single proposition. That for me is very ingenious at the time. That go back to translating this idea of tautology from Kossou into more specific conceptual language of tautology. That Thompson described in a completely different way, this kind of igualitarism of a visual presentation, not clear subordinate or background, not clear secondary themes or passages. That's kind of multilingual. This is the way Robert Farris Thompson described this idea of tautology, when this multilingual process merged together in one single framework. And this is an example of going back to the most important, in terms of money, work of Latin American Caribbean art. This is The Jungle from Wilfredo Lam. This is the higher price you can get in the non-Western art in the market. And it's made of brown paper, wrapping paper. It's displays in one of the hall at MoMA. And now it's one of the masterpieces from MoMA, completely ignored for many years. And many of the reference from Lambs at the time, what I think is a failure. Even he's celebrated with one of the best, one of the giants of contemporary art, modern art. For me, it's a failure. As a Cuban, I think it's one of the big failures in Cuban art. But all the reference, even jungle have a negative connotation. Jungle have to do with Hollywood fantasy in 1930 and rainforest. What he thinks is the rainforest is a sugar field. And then somehow he used a term that doesn't have to do with what is depicted in the image. All the African reference you can see here have to do with African art, African culture never being transported to Cuba. And he thinks is the quintessential example of Cuban art. And the last one, I don't have to get into politics, but he thinks he went to Cuba later, never give a reading to the Caesar, but he thought that this is Caesar being used from the Third World to cut from brutal capitalism and imperialism. That's very specific political statement to get back to Cuba being accepted in Cuba political system. But anyway, what you have is the most celebrated in price and visually artists and Bedia, still celebrated, but hasn't really get to that level of complexity. But going back to this idea of art, of activism, that is idea in somehow you have a license to refer to African art because you are African and somehow belong to you. You are entitled to refer to. And you can have this, and somehow this kind of conversation that cannot really take place, cannot really operate without understanding the principle of the artistic culture reference that you wanted to empower. This is another example from Trigo Paula that go from a bidimensional work, painting, and inspired from the real object is three-dimensional, this maternity. And they are very specific, the reading of this maternity, mother and child, whatever you want to call. But you have these the issues of race, they are critical in the way Trigo is making reference to herself through that particular particular image that is somehow taken away the history of Nkisi and Gudia is the name of that particular object on the right. Or you have another artist like René Stout that she's building and using that term, or the term that I think is unacceptable for me, fetish number 3, to evoke this idea of Congo art in African American artistic practice in the present day. This is she's still doing that in the present day. None of these objects really are treated and prepared with the knowledge of traditional, conventional, historical, Nkisi and Kondi. Or you have the fetish number 2, it's really more like a life-size figure that build echoing the aesthetic of Nkisi and Kondi, but without understanding how the Nkisi and Kondi really work. There's another artist from Angola that making reference to specifically Chokwe culture in Angola, and the cosmogram. This is a pole, or one pole, a mask that represent it's a cosmogram itself, that represent the 4 cardinal points and how they are a special marker in the Chokwe culture, and also had to do with womenhood initiations, coming to the age of decision in the pole tradition. But it's somehow he missed the most important element of the whole masquerade, specifically the mask, and just refers to cosmogram as something somehow you will understand by just depicting the pole mask. The only you will have association in Angola with being initiated in become to the age of Mukanda, becoming a woman. This is another example of artists who intend to solve this problem of what is historical, what is contemporary. And this is David Hammond's spirit writing. And he has a series of 21 drawings. And according to many of a graphic writing tradition, when you ask to the spirit to write, they always write like this. This is the way the spirit writing. They write information, the notation they wanted to convey to believers. And he evoked this ancient methodology of recording African-based graphic writing in Americas, in the whole continent, and specific through Trinidad, because that writing really took place in America. I think maybe you will find in New Orleans very specific places, but very hard to find. You will find in the Caribbean foundation drawing, revival drawing, firmas, veve, ponto riscado. Just mentioned few of the traditions that you go back to 400 years of writing in those places. But he just is somehow co-opting this form of writing from the Caribbean and making statement about this African theme. That somehow is part of this new approach to be, to be everywhere. We are hybridized. We have given the license to adopt, upset everything from everyone and from everywhere. There's another example of artists who thinking somehow they had to go into the mystery and the prohibitions of art, what is taboo. And this is Belkis Ayong, who was a Cuban artist. She killed herself back a couple of years ago. And it had to do about the male is a secret society for men's secret society in Cuba that came from a secret society in Cameroon and Nigeria, the EFIC in Ejergan, Also, they have a counterpart female society. It's not secret. Initiatory society, well, we made secret in Cuba, or in many places. I don't know if secret for who, but anyway. But you have this female artist. We believe her work had to do with the fact she's a woman and she cannot have access because it's just for male. It's just for men, and she cannot have access. The idea of taboo or prohibition is very important in the way she talks about the subject matter, and she's always presenting herself as an unwelcome witness, and somehow is revealing the truth of this tradition, is revealing the secret, the principle, and what is important for that tradition only for men. It's a little bit more complicated, just giving us this idea of being initiated in an African tradition become a kind of obsession for many of the artists. Most of the artists who work in the Caribbean, in Latin America, with African tradition, they always have the passport. I've been initiated in such and such religion, because it will give a credibility and way into kind of moral credibility into what they're doing and how they're doing. This is another example of Faisal Agbola, the one being mentioned, is a Jamaica immigrant family, moved to London. He born in London, converted to Islam in 1981 in Boston when he was in exchange from the Royal College. And as he talked about these issues of transition from Pentecostal tradition into being Muslim, and this crisis of identity took place in 1981 up to the present day. What I call that dislocation, to be dislocated from his religious tradition, spiritual tradition, back from his family, back from Jamaica, to become a Muslim in the US and back to London, and how this thing is somehow shaping the way he's understanding his artistic practice. And this is what you see, the tapestry, two of the tapestry I produced for an exhibition. I did like a middle career retrospective of his work. And this talk about this idea of a crisis, religious crisis, a spiritual crisis. And I want to finish with what is on display, because somehow Numosa asked me to make reference. And what I think there are the three words you always find very often in African photography, and also Caribbean photography, this idea of spirituality. There's a new ontological dimension in somehow affecting the way artists talking about themselves. There's a new ontological paradigms that is somehow the artists are embracing, they are very conscious of. And we call spirituality, it's a very big, very big word that doesn't really go to a specific. You have a Nigerian Yoruba artist, a Yoruba background, came from a hardcore Yoruba family, talking about, it's interesting because I think his early work used to be for me more, more powerful, more efficient in what he wanted to communicate, but this is my personal observation. This is a very important image that links the specific initiation in Yoruba tradition. That somehow is this very clever and simple, the reference to Yoruba tradition. When you move into desire, you somehow talk about those issues of relationship between the West and Africa, the West and the others, and the periphery. In this case, non-African tradition. There's a lot of debate about religious crisis from Africa, but anyway, I don't want to go into these kind of things right now. But talking about a well-known, recognized religious Western tradition is somehow being presented as part of African visual framework, in the one desire to be inscribed in this kind of Western trends. And diaspora, in a way, this is a fan mask that doesn't have anything to do with Nigeria. You have an African artist making the similar kind of statement other artists are making in the Caribbean, making reference to African tradition from other places because they think they are entitled to do so. And for me, it's very problematic that in somehow created kind of universal African art, because we are African, it's part of us. And I think it's in a way where you can see all this struggle in many artists, and somehow you have three different projects coming together. The exhibition is presented as one thing because it's kind of retrospective, one photographer, but there are three different propositions for me as an artist that is very indicative of the problems of the present day. in Africa and in the diaspora, because one of the things you might know, the African artists and Caribbean, Latin American artists, they are more in contact right now since the last 15 years than before. And I think it's this kind of exchange and idea that they are more common, they are more relevant, they are more into the knowledge of many of the artists in both sides, or all, you know, upside the periphery, you want to call. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I think it's the images that are too big, and sometimes the photography. But just given the name of the pieces and the years, and you can see just showing other pieces and somehow, you know, illustrate this idea of a multiple projects, different type of questions coming together into this guessing, so looking for a position in the art world. Thank you very much.